Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Live at 5. I am curator Kevin Adkisson, coming to you live from the middle of Academy Way. And today, the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research is bringing you a two-part tour of two very related objects. The Jonah and the Whale sculpture by Carl Milles, and then I will do a walk-around of the beloved and dearly missed Lake Jonah. And when I give tours around Cranbrook, I am often people of a certain age and familiarity with Cranbrook. I would say that Lake Jonah is an area of campus that has been much missed and much beloved. And the story of Lake Jonah really starts here with Jonah himself. I suppose I could say it goes all the way back to the 8th century BC to Jonah of the story, the biblical story, Jonah and the whale. But we will fast forward to the creation of this sculpture by the great Swedish sculptor Carl Milles. And Jonah is shown here, sort of quite surprised, popping out of the whale's mouth. And he is sort of looking forward. And what he sees, if he turns around, perhaps he's shocked to find himself here in Oakland County, looking back down a brand new street. Because Jonah and the Whale was placed at the end of Academy Way in August of 1932, which was the same time that the Cranbrook Academy of Art was opening for classes. The Academy's history, which I've talked a lot about on many other tours, is a little more complicated, but opening day for what we now call Cranbrook Academy of Art was in August of 32, the same time that Jonah and the Whale was installed. And this piece, if you aren't as familiar with Carl Milles, the Swedish sculptor, he was largely considered in the 1920s to be sort of Europe's most important figural sculpture. He was considered the sort of descendant of Rodin in Paris, and he had studied with Rodin in the around 1904, 1905. He was famous in Europe. He was trying to make inroads in America, and he ends up at Cranbrook through the invitation of George Booth and through the encouragement of our architect Eliel Saarinen. Now, Milles arrives here right after New Year's of 1931, and the story of how he got here I told at my very first Live at 5 back in March, so you can scroll back after today's tour and learn a bit more about Milles and his works over at the Art Museum. But he arrives here with his wife Olga in 1931, and he is initially given this commission to do a sculpture, but it was not going to be at this location. The commission initially was for the academic quadrangle at Kingswood. Now, this is the main sort of one-story courtyard at the far western edge of Kingswood, and it's where Milles' sculpture of Diana now stands on a base by Eliel Saarinen, because as he begins working on this special commission of Jonah and the Whale, George Booth sort of said, I actually don't know how the subject matter of Jonah and the Whale came about, but of course the Booths were very religious, and Milles was interested in sort of religious and folklore scenes, so he did a lot of kind of Nordic heroes, Greek and Roman myths, as well as religious scenes. But when they get ready to install it at Kingswood, the whole fountain is just deemed a little bit too big. And so working with Eliel Saarinen, Milles and George Booth, they together agree that they will move Jonah and the Whale here to the end of the brand new Academy Way. And on sort of opening day in 1932, the Academy did not come nearly as close to Jonah as it is now. It's pretty hard to see on this tiny little screen, but really the houses, only Saarinen House and Milles House were the sort of last pieces of the Academy. So it was only halfway up to its full extent, and it would be another decade before the Art Museum opens. Now, once the location changed, Millis, who loved wax, when they came out and the Detroit News wrote about Jonah and the whale being installed here, suggested that Millis was the heir to Bernini because of the way that Millis played with water and with bronze. And once Millis had moved the sculpture to this location, he wants even more water. And so you see these wonderful little fish here, which are spraying the water. And Millis just adds more and more fish, more and more spray. Water also comes out of the whale's mouth. And all of our fountains are off this year, but you can see all of those wonderful little water spouts so that it really appears when the water is turned on that Jonah is flying with the water. The problem came about, though, is that this is meant to be the basin. And so the water is supposed to stay within the entire bronze construction. Of course, it did not. And Millis, instead of, turning down the water or aiming them a different direction, he takes George Booth's suggestion, and Booth just says, we'll make a bigger base for it. And so Saarinen and Millis designed together, I assume, this octagonal base and this very Saarinen design of this octagonal pool within a larger sort of square courtyard, so that the water now flings entirely off the sculpture and it's sort of a two-tiered arrangement. Now, this will be the only sculpture at Cranbrook made by Carl Millis at Cranbrook for Cranbrook. So every other Millis sculpture, and there are over 60 on campus, were either made at Cranbrook for a location elsewhere, and a copy was installed at Cranbrook, or it was made by Millis in Sweden or in Rome, and a copy was purchased for Cranbrook. And that would create some resentments between Booth and Millis later on, because Millis really thought that he was going to have a lot like Eliel Saarinen, not only a sort of lifetime appointment, but a lifetime of commissions. And the Jonah and the Whale, which was commissioned right when he arrives in winter of 1931, installed right when the Academy opens and the first sculpture students enroll, that's the only work that George Booth commissioned specifically from Millis. Now, of course, he would, for many millions of dollars equivalent, buy in 1934 some 60 works of Carl Millis to install to help Millis feel more at home here, much to our benefit who gets to enjoy them. But none other of these sculptures were made for Cranbrook at Cranbrook by Millis. Now, if you've never come up close to the sculpture, there's actually quite a bit of wonderful scenes down around the base that tell the whole sort of story of the book of Jonah, from the Torah, from the Bible, from the Quran. And so here we have God, the hand of God is reaching out and telling Jonah down here, and Jonah says, "But Lord, I'll not preach to these people." And here is the start of our problems. And so instead of heading to Nineveh, where the Lord has demanded Jonah go, Jonah attempts to escape from the Lord's commandment, and so he sets sails to Tarshish, which is just away from Israel. And so Jonah takes a ship to flee from the Lord's command, and here he is on the ship, fleeing from God, which, pro tip, don't try that. And so as we keep moving, we see now the arrival of the storm. And what I love is that God's hand continues to appear on all of these sort of braces around the great bronze base. As we pass by, I'll also point out, here is the foundry that made all of Millis's sculptures. So all of the bronzes, the majority of the bronzes were cast by the Herman Bergman studio in Stockholm, where they still cast Millis's work. Continuing on with our story, the ship casts lots. Jonah admits that the reason the storm is happening is because he is on board, avoiding God. And so he demands to be thrown over. And here we see the arrival of the big fish, known as a whale in English translations of the Bible. In the Hebrew, it's just a big fish. And technically, though we call this sculpture Jonah and the Whale, its official name is just the Jonah Fountain. So we don't officially at Cranbrook take a stand on the whale versus fish debate. So he gets swallowed up by the fish, and then here we see the end of his 3-day submarine journey in the belly of the whale. And so now he is sort of released, and he's shocked, and ashore he agrees finally to the Lord's command to go and preach to the people of Nineveh. And the Lord was satisfied with Jonah, it says there. And then we look around, and I love all the sort of little animals that make appearances. This is one of the sinning citizens of Nineveh, whom Jonah is preaching to. And so here we see Jonah obeys the Lord's commands to preach. And I think if I saw a minister who looked like that, I also might decide to convert and change my ways. Though these people of Nineveh are not really having the reaction I would expect if I saw a man swirling about in robes with the lightning of God behind him. But it works, and the people of Nineveh are saved. And God, who had promised to destroy Nineveh, which is what what Jonah was going to tell them, was that God was going to smite them. Instead, God forgives the people of Nineveh, and Jonah goes outside of the city to wait for Nineveh to be destroyed. And here, Millis tells us, Jonah likes to sleep in the shadow of the gourd. A dog disturbs his slumber, which I'm not sure if the dog is in the telling. Now, of course, what happens next is that a little worm comes and he kills the vine, and Jonah gets hot, and he demands the Lord kill him because he is so miserable without his vine. And then the Lord tells him, hey, did you do anything to deserve that vine? Did you nurture it or watch it grow? Jonah's like, nope. And then the Lord's like, so how would you feel if you were me and I created those 120,000 people in Nineveh and I was watching them be destroyed? You must learn your lesson here and sort of learn to forgive. Don't ask me for religious classes, everyone. But I think it is interesting because I know for me, at least, I went a few years before I ever really focused on the base of the Jonah fountain and how it told the complete story of Jonah, not just with his incident with the big fish, but his whole sort of journey from disobeying the Lord to going to Nineveh to finding his vine outside of the city. So the main sculpture is here, but then it is not it's not just on its own, it's part of a larger architectural arrangement. So I will step back and we will observe these great pylons, which were designed by Eliel Saarinen in Indiana limestone. And in early drawings of the sort of termination of this view, Eliel Saarinen was going to suggest carving these pylons, which would have been very sort of Scandinavian classicism, to actually have sculptural pylons instead of just blank monoliths. In other designs, he proposed putting sculptures here, which was a sort of classical way, a Roman way of displaying sculptures that Rodin did, that Millis liked. And of course, when we reinstall Orpheus in the Arts and Crafts courtyard, Orpheus is standing on a great column. Eventually, nothing ever happens. I don't know actually what the tale is as to how the columns remain unornamented, but I think they're much more sort of modern in this way, where you have the rich figural narrative sculpture in the center, and then these sort of blank columns on either side. And then there are these pretty amazing sea life urns. They are identical, and these were sculpted from 1927 to 1929 by Millis when he was in his Swedish studio. They were sculpted for the city of Gothenburg, and they're adapted from a fountain he did in Gothenburg, a larger base. And he sort of used the same figures of swimmers and fishes and octopuses and urchins, which he had used on a fountain base, and he reapplied them to an urn. Now, I'm not sure exactly what year ours were cast in Sweden, but there is another set of these at the Brooklyn Museum of Art, cast in 1932. Here we see Carl Millis's little cipher, his signature. And then here we see the swimmers and the octopus down there. And so that leads us to our next portion of the tour, now that we can see the sort of total aquatic arrangement of Jonah and his fish, but then also the swimmers on the urn. It leads us 1 year later back down to the creation of a series of waterways. And George Booth thought that there should be a body of water here, and he realized that if he built a pond at the end of the Academy Way behind the boys' school dormitory, people would swim in it. And so instead of just building another little small lake, George Booth decided that he would build this as a swimming pool. And so once he kind of committed to it being a swimming pool, it developed and advanced and has been through many phases. It opened in the summer of 1933 and was used until the summer of 1999 as Cranbrook's main swimming pool. Now, like so many things at Cranbrook, the Lake Jonah or Jonah Lake or Jonah Pools have had many names. Those are the most common names that we use today. But George Booth actually wanted to call it Lake Manitou after the Algonquin peoples. That name didn't stick, and so then it became Millis Fountain Lake. But Millis Fountain Lake is a little bit of a mouthful, and so the fountain still inspired the name of the pools, but the one that stuck was, of course, Lake Jonah. And you might think, oh, okay, well, Jonah and the whale is sitting at the top, the pools are down below it. That's the relationship. But it was actually one that was even more interconnected, in that the Jonah Fountain was feeding all of the water into the pool. So instead of just circulating water through that basin, the water sprouted out of the fish and then drained down into the pool. And it was that way for decades, including after the pools had closed. And so if you've noticed in the past 2 or 3 years, that the water levels in Lake Jonah are really much lower, that's because the fountain is now circulating water and there's no natural way for this to fill up. So I have come down the pathway to the old swimming hole, and we have arrived at this great whale-shaped body of water. And if you go on Google Maps and you look, Lake Jonah is shaped like a whale. I don't think that that is intentional. I think it's a bit like Eero Saarinen's piano-shaped lake at the University of Michigan School of Music, where you sort of see the shape you want to see. But it is a naturalistic shaped body of water. And the design of the Lake Jonah swimming pool was developed by the Cranbrook Architectural Office, which Eliel Saarinen was the head of. But we don't really consider this to be an Eliel Saarinen design, because Saarinen was the head of the Architectural Office, but there were projects that he was not himself personally responsible for. So we just attribute the design to Cranbrook Architectural Office. And it doesn't have a smooth bottom, so the pool gets deeper and deeper to 17 or about 20 feet deep. It's really quite deep in the center. And originally it was just made of compacted blue clay. So they excavated out the entire size of the Jonah pool, and then they took blue clay, which was thought to be waterproof, and they packed it around the edge of the pool. The problem with that was that it didn't actually hold the water, and so the pool drained multiple times during the first season. And the decision was made by the Cranbrook Foundation to waterproof the entire pool. So in 1934, they built up layers of hot tar with burlap in between them. And so it went tar, burlap, tar, burlap, tar, burlap to create this waterproofed pool. The problem with that method of construction is that in the freeze-thaw cycle, the edges of the pool would be destroyed each winter and they would have to be patched. So here I've never noticed this. Here we see the drainage for, I assume, the Jonah fountain coming out here. And then if we turn around, we can see that we are below the fountain here. Now, I have heard tales, and I'm sure that some of these people who are watching, some of my fans out there, you have swum here and know more than I do about how it was used. I heard that this was the dressing room, but I was looking in archives today, or Deborah was looking for me, and we found no evidence of blueprints that this was a dressing room. Instead, what we found was a 1954 memo where Henry Booth is suggesting to the Cranbrook Foundation that restrooms and changing rooms for Lake Jonah should be constructed. And Henry Booth has a note in his records where he says, "It is interesting that we've gotten this far into the life of Lake Jonah and only now need a restroom. I suppose there are simply less trees on campus," which is pretty funny. The pool was first used by initially just the Cranbrook community, so it was used by the boarding students and the art students. There are wonderful videos made by Charles Eames of the art students and the Saarinen and many of the artists lounging around the banks of the pool. It's always had this soft grass edge. And then it also became a sort of fixture of the Cranbrook summer camps. And so the very first summer camps at Cranbrook were held during World War II. Summer camps for girls under 14 that were doing projects that contributed to the war effort. After the war, that became the Cranbrook Summer Institute after 1947. But really, all the summer programs used Lake Jonah. So Horizon Upward Bounds in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the Cranbrook Theater School, the Cranbrook Summer Institute, really anything that was happening here in the summer, you came and swam. Now, the pool is absolutely massive. You can see as we walk around it towards the old diving board here. The pool itself is some 1.25 acres in size, or 54,375 square feet, and it holds 3,082,832 gallons of water when it is at its peak. And you'll see that today the pool really doesn't hold water, and so imagine that the water line actually goes up to the grass. So in the home videos from the 30s, it really is just sort of grass and then water. So the whole thing would look, I think, much larger if the water level was held all the way up. A nice little President's Award bench here to come and sit and contemplate this gorgeous fall day here in Michigan. Now, with the liner, with the drain, with the waterproofing, with the paving, and then with the landscaping, it cost George Booth some $34,000 to build the pool. That would be about $680,000 today if we just did the inflation. But I think to ever repair the pool for swimming, which is not part of Cranbrook's vision for the future, would certainly cost much more than $1 million to get it back up and running or even to build it new. Now, what happened to the pool? Eventually, we'll see where Cranbrook swims today. But what eventually happened was the sort of maintenance of this pool. It was a struggle that first season in 1933. It was a struggle every season thereafter. And by the 90s, it was really becoming both a huge expense to maintain, but also a liability. In particular, the Crane Clarion, the Cranbrook newspaper, said that the president's office told reporters it was a financial sinkhole and a liability, that with the tar-colored bottom, you couldn't see people swimming in the center, that it was too big for lifeguards to safely monitor, and so it would be shut down for swimming. The President's Award bench, these commemorate the annual winners of the President's Award for Excellence, designed by Gary Griffin, the former head of the metalsmithing department. And so it's generally, though not always, a winner from schools, Arts Academy, our art museum, science, and community, though that changes. So these are all around campus. Now, the pool itself had a landscape designer who helped make all of these woods and who did the planting scheme of the Lake Jonah. And Lake Jonah is actually a series of 3 lakes, and so we'll walk by and we'll see all of them. But the landscape architect was a young man named Edward Eichstädt, who was a Detroit landscape architect. He had trained in the Chicago office of Jens Jensen, the great Danish-American landscape architect who was sort of father of the Midwest prairie school style of landscaping. He was Frank Lloyd Wright's favorite landscape architect. Frank Lloyd Wright even designed his letterhead. Here in Detroit, you know a Jens Jensen landscape if you have ever visited the Edsel and Eleanor Ford house with its wonderful naturalistic shaped pool and just that beautiful sort of naturalistic style landscaping. Now, Edward Eichstädt came to George Booth and asked for work here at Cranbrook. What could he show beyond his partnerships with Jens Jensen or under Jensen? Well, at this point, Eichstädt had designed the Alvin Macaulay landscape. That was the president of Packard, and that was an Albert Kahn designed house of 1929. He had also designed the Kellogg Company's main park in downtown Battle Creek, and I think those 2 commissions probably sealed George Booth's confidence in a man to create the plantings here. And so we have those planting plans in Cranbrook Archives, and it's a wide variety of trees, shrubs, and lawns. And Eichstädt also did the landscape around Kingswood School, so he is responsible for all of the trees and plantings and the courtyard gardens there. Now, we're moving down to Little Jonah, so each of the pools flows one into the other, and then eventually flows into the Rouge River tributary at the bottom of the valley. And so this is Little Jonah, which was where you learned to swim, and was a smaller pool. And we see actually Eichstadt's original way of creating the barrier of the pool, which was to have boulders set in concrete with then smaller boulders between. The concrete deck that I'm standing on is a little bit later. It was not here in the 30s. It looks like from photographs it was here by 1950. And so this smaller pool, which was fed from the main pool coming down in a waterfall, then continued even further into Baby Jonah, which was the children's pool. And again, the water level, because the pools are not solid, the water leaks out and will fill up or drain into the groundwater. And so this is the sort of natural height where the water wants to come over and then flow down the waterfall into Baby Jonah, which was where, I assume, littlest children with their parents could swim. And when it came to the design of the landscape here, which is obviously now kind of beautifully overgrown, Eichstädt envisioned that there would be 2 lawns on either side of this pool. So there would be a little lawn here where you could get sun and then you could swim across. But he actually wanted plants to come all the way up to the edge of the pool like it was a forested glen. And then there would be another grassy lawn here where you could swim. If anyone has any questions, do feel free to type them in. So one of the stories, I did this tour yesterday on Instagram, and one of our followers, Hildreth Butterbaugh, Cranbrook class of 1961, sent me a message of a story that he had heard, and it vaguely feels familiar to me. Which was that the sealing of the pools was so bad that during World War II, they actually flooded and seeped out, and they began filling up the basements of the houses here on Academy Way, which which is still where the high school faculty lives. And as the water from Lake Jonah filled up the basements, it attacked all of the rations that were being stored because it was World War II. And so Cranbrook had a stockpile of canned foods. And as the basement filled up with water, all of the labels washed off the cans. And so for months or years afterwards, they would play a game where the students would shake the can and try and guess what they were going to get once they opened the can. Hildreth also told me that in the 80s you would come to Cranbrook and you bought your swimming pass over at Cranbrook House, and then that was how you got to use the pool as a community as a community member. And the center's former administrative assistant, Jody, she actually met her husband while swimming here at Cranbrook. And then another story that I heard was that Cranbrook would use its fire truck to actually clean out the pool. And so once they were drained for the winter, the fire truck would just drive into Lake Jonah and hose it down end to end. So once the pools were closed, where did Cranbrook students swim? Well, that was our brand new natatorium, our indoor swimming pool, which is right now going under a series of renovations with a new pool deck. And so in 1999, this building, which we'll hopefully do a Live at 5 tour of sometime soon, was constructed by Todd Williams and Billy Shin architects. Husband and wife team working out of New York, but Todd Williams is a Cranbrook Schools graduate. And of course, his parents were longtime donors and leaders here at Cranbrook, and it is the Williams Natatorium in honor of their lead donations and support for the pool. So this is where swimmers ended up once they went and no longer swam outdoors. But what's interesting are the sort of lessons that the 1999 natatorium took from this history of outdoor swimming. The Booths had multiple swimming pools at their house in the early 20th century. There was Lake Jonah from the 1930s. And so what Todd and Billy did was they built a sky on their pool that is a great dark blue ceiling with the lights sort of arranged as if they are stars. And then they also sunk the windows down to the level of the pool deck so that when you're swimming, you look out and you see the sort of stand of pine trees that runs this whole length of the campus. And it is kind of magical as you swim in the natatorium. It really does feel like you're sort of outdoor swimming at midnight in Finland. Working with the landscape architect Peter Osler, they also developed the school bus turnaround here for the Cranbrook campus. And I have just walked up this slope of a hill. And the hill here is part of the landscape architect Peter Osler's plan for the natatorium. The pool was excavated, the dirt was brought here, and then it was placed into this shallow hill. And so watch as I walk backwards on this beautiful day, what happens to that car that's going around? It should disappear. And then the further back I walk, the less and less of the car turnaround, the bus turnaround, I can see. And this is an 18th century English garden landscape design developed by John Constable and other sort of English garden planners. And it's called a ha-ha wall because you can hide anything behind it. And so now, as I'm a little bit further away, you see how it looks just like a rolling hill of grass all the way to the natatorium. And ha-ha, the little turnaround has been completely hidden. Why would we need a ha-ha wall here? Well, this is the sort of longest and most sacred axis running from George Booth's office all the way to the natatorium. And in particular, the view from the art museum was what they were thinking of. And how tacky and pedestrian would it look if we looked off the art museum and saw big yellow school buses right there? And so by installing the ha-ha wall, you hide any sort of activity or school buses, and it looks just like a lovely rolling promenade of lawn with the dormitories on one side for the art academy and school, and then the beautiful pine trees on the other. And with that, we have now made it back to where we began. So we see Academy Way here, and then of course, here is Jonah and the whale. And so the last story I'll share with us is a little project from 1995 would have added a guest house directly behind Jonah and the whale. It would have been designed by the great theoretical architect John Haydock. It was called the House of the Poet. You can Google House of the Poet Cranbrook and you'll see pictures. Many people are glad it is not there. I kind of love it and admire Haydock's rigorous work of architecture. But he actually wanted to build the guest house directly behind Jonah. And it would have been made of 3 little pavilions with pointy roofs. And it would have sort of been, the living room would have been framed perfectly behind Jonah, looking straight up Academy Way. And the whole structure was rising out of the woods on thin little pylons. And so you would have had visitors to Cranbrook staying in this sort of woodland retreat with swimmers down below, and then looking out over Academy Way. And then on the other end of the street in 2000, when the Griffin gates were installed, the next time you're driving down Lone Pine and the gates are closed, you'll see in the center of the gates there is a little opening that the vertical steel portions of the gate line up perfectly with the stone columns at this end of the street. So it's still very much this sort of center on which Cranbrook designers and artists are thinking about how we interact with the campus, the sort of relationship of Jonah and his fish at the center, and then all the roads and nature changing around or moving around off of it. Now, what's going to happen to Lake Jonah? Of course, do not swim in the pools today. And the little loop that I just made did go onto parts of private campus property. So follow our signs. If they say private area, do not pass them, like I just did. As part of Cranbrook's master plan developed between 2014 and 2016 by the landscape architects Reed Hildebrand, they suggested building a performing arts center on the other side of the lake, and converting Lake Jonah, instead of being just sort of an unused swimming pool, naturalizing it, bringing in plant life and cattails and adding a little overlook, and essentially turning it into a more natural lake instead of just an abandoned swimming pool. It sort of seems like that's going to happen before Cranbrook does anything to it. It looks more and more natural every year. But that is the thought, is to keep it as a water feature and as a design feature as the campus continues to expand. I don't know if anyone else has any other questions. This is not heaven. We will not be going to heaven on Live at 5, unfortunately. I did request to go there and it was forbidden. But perhaps just watching me for a few minutes each week is heaven. So in sense, it is heaven. Any other questions? An event involving Jell-O. I haven't heard that one, but it does seem like something for boarding school students to throw Jell-O in. A child wandered in and drowned. That is very sad. I have heard multiple stories about drowning. We did look in archives to try and just see if there were stories of drownings, or one of the great myths of Cranbrook is that bodies were found in Lake Jonah. We don't have any record of it, but if you do have any other information, I would love to learn a bit more, because I could not find any information about the lake. What about the bubbles? I don't know about the bubbles. So thanks so much for watching again today, everyone. And thanks to everyone who responded to my call last week for additional suggestions of where we might go together for Live at 5. I have made a list. This was a suggestion brought about from my dad, so thanks, Dr. Dale, for wanting to learn more about Jonah and the Jonah Pools. If you have memories of swimming here at Lake Jonah and you want to share them, feel free to send them as a comment or as a message. We love collecting and learning from people who have used Cranbrook. I was only 9 when the pool shut down, and I grew up in Georgia, so I certainly never swam in it. And I will reaffirm that we will not be restoring it, and you will not be swimming here anytime soon. And don't try to go on the ice in the winter either. It is really a very thin sheet of ice. There is a map online for guests if you just search Cranbrook map, and it should lay out the paths that are open to the public versus private. But the pathways are now marked ever since the pandemic began. So you'll see red or yellow and black signs that say private area, do not enter. And just please respect those, because there are many families, including myself, who live here on campus, and it is a little disconcerting to look out your window and see someone looking in. Thanks so much for joining for another tour of Lake Jonah and Jonah and the Whale. I will be back next week, Wednesday, live at 5. There's also 2 events coming up on October 17th. That's a Sunday. We're going to be joining our colleagues around the country with the Documenting Modernism Society, DocoMomo, celebrating the 1970s turning 50. And so we will be doing a tour from Royal Oaks Bolero, which is a 1970s restored bowling alley. And then I will give a short lecture on 70s architecture in Michigan, things like the Renaissance Center or the Power Center at the University of Michigan or the Douglas House by Richard Meyer. And then I will do a very special 70s groovy tour of the Frank Lloyd Wright Smith House and talk about what the Smiths were doing, the art they were collecting in the 70s, but also all of the different organizations they were supporting in the 70s. So you can buy tickets to that on center.cranbrook.edu. And then on October 27th, I will be delivering the next Uncovering Cranbrook virtual lecture, and that will be about Eero Saarinen and Yale. He was both a student at Yale and the architect of 3 buildings at Yale. And so that should be an exciting lecture. As we all know, Yale is America's greatest university. So I have nothing more to say on that note. Okay, and then a virtual Millis Garden tour. Stay tuned. If you want to learn more about Millis, we are in the process of launching our 2021 house party at Cranbrook, our annual fundraiser. I think it may be too soon for me to give details out now, but it will be a global house party, and it's going to be a virtual and hopefully in-person as well event. And maybe Carl Millis and maybe Millis Garden in Sweden will have a little role to play. So get excited about our spring 2021 fundraiser coming up. Thanks so much, everyone, for watching, and I will be back right here on Facebook next Wednesday for another Live at 5.